Thank you all. It's a real honor to be here tonight. It's an honor to have such a large crowd. I walk when I talk, so that's what you get. A couple of things. Can everybody hear me? Seems like the acoustics are really good in here. Out in front, we have our flyers. You may notice, see, similar. The flyers for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And if you want to find out what's going on around the state or around our centers, feel free to pick one up, and there's information on the bottom about where you can go to our website. We've always got stuff going on, and we try to partner with the local FAS chapters. I'm also very proud to say that I had part to do with the Archaeology Month poster last year, which was about native people, native plants. We have little bookmarks out there about this. It was an interesting process to go through having a poster made, and this one I was honored to be asked to help because of my background in plants. And finally, the most important thing, of course, is that we always have swag. And this time the swag that I brought was little bottle openers. So that's all of you who just came for the bottle openers. I'll turn my back and you can sneak out because there's still a few left. And as I go through this, I always tell people, and poor Ray has already heard me talk today, I tell people I talk to myself all the time. I don't find myself that interesting, so please talk to me. I mean, that's why I'm here. I'm here to have a conversation with you. Okay, you ready? Let's go. Let's see if I can. All right, we're not going to use that. That's fair enough. See, adapting, that's the trick. The Florida Public Archaeology Network is a not-for-profit organization, and our job is to help preserve the archaeology of Florida by teaching people about the archaeology of Florida. It's our belief that an educated people are more likely to be interested in helping preserve the archaeology because it's so fascinating and so fragile. So that's who the Florida Public Archaeology Network is. How many people here haven't heard of us before? Yes! New converts. Okay. And we're a statewide organization. I say that altogether we make one good archaeologist. Each of us in these centers have different specialties. So I'm down here in the pretty part of Florida. Oh, I can't say that here, can I? My region covers Palm Beach to the Dry Tortugas. You got to admit that's kind of a pretty area. And our office is located in downtown Fort Lauderdale. But at the same time, you know, here in the West Central region, Jeff and Ray have their specialties. Jeff specializes in underwater archaeology and marine archaeology, and Ray is an education specialist. So altogether, we make one good archaeologist. This talk is sort of developed from a collaboration between Dr. Rachel Wentz and myself. Rachel did her master's and PhD on the human remains from the Windover site, and we started talking about the diseases these people had, and as a result of that discussion, I went back and looked at the analysis that had been done on the plant remains from the Windover site. And together we started talking about, do the plants that are at the site represent attempts to alleviate the symptoms of the diseases these people were experiencing? So what can you do to help FPAN? What can you do to help archaeology in Florida? The most important thing anyone can do is learn. And hopefully tonight you're going to learn at least one new thing. If nothing else, you learned my name. We got to go with the minimums. And teach somebody. That way we double the number of people we contact. We've got 80, 90 people here tonight, but if we get every one of you to talk to someone else about archaeology, that means we've reached 180 people. So that doubles our reach. Volunteer. Volunteer someplace. Volunteer to help preserve. Volunteer at your local FAS chapter. Volunteer at the Whedon Preserve. There's plenty of places that need bodies, and not all of them do you have to be outside digging in the heat. Most of them, we need people to help with the administration, to help with being nice to people at the front counters of activities. That's all we need, but we need those individuals because altogether we've got about 20 people in the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and that's not enough to preserve the archaeology of Florida. Finally, as we know, really the only way that anything happens is if we tell our lawmakers that they have to do it. And that's something that almost everyone in this room can do. Tell your lawmakers that the archaeology of Florida is important. I know, I know. I know, and that's why we have to tell them. Because if we don't tell our lawmakers who work for us what they're supposed to do, then they won't do it. So what we want to do is make Florida's past part of everyone's future. I made that up. Okay. Questions? All right, you're going to shout out because I might not see your hand in the air. So this talk came about, as I said, because Rachel and I were talking about the Windover site and the human remains at the Windover site. How many of you know about the Windover site? Quite a few. And how many of you actually worked at the Windover site? There's usually a couple. All right. This was a project that was done in the 1980s, and I'll go into more depth with it. But as you can see, it's a beautiful place to do it doesn't look like that beautiful place to do archaeology. What the Windover Pond is literally, it's a pond, and it was discovered during construction of, what do we do in Florida? We build condos. And so there was a construction project going on, and they were draining the pond so they could build condos, as we love to do. And in this process, they started seeing human remains show up. And they did what you're supposed to do, which is call the police. And then the police called the coroner. And the coroner said, this isn't a mass murder. This appears to be something much older. Does anyone know how, just by looking at a skeleton, that you could tell that it was significantly older than the past 100 years? This is really easy. Teeth. All of us have fillings, or most of us have fillings. And that technology didn't exist about 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So if you, and hopefully this won't happen to any of you, knock on wood, but if you encounter a skeleton and it doesn't have fillings, it's probably a good indicator that it's a fairly old skeleton. So when the coroner realized these were old skeletons, archaeologists were called in, and this huge project developed.
Where is this?
Well, all right, we're going to get there. This is actually, I'll tell you now though, because you asked. It is up near Cape Canaveral on the East Coast. We're going to do 4 things tonight. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Florida prehistory. I'm going to tell you more about the Windover site. I'm going to give you some information about the plants that were identified associated with the human remains. And in particular, I'm going to tell you about a burial that was called Burial 125. Just imagine, someday archaeologists are going to find us and we'll not be called our names, but something like Burial 125. Ugh. So, and poor Ray, this is the second time today you get this. This is my attempt to do archaeology of Florida in one slide. So I make everybody hold up 4 fingers. Does everybody have at least 4 fingers between their 2 hands? If not, it's a little chilly tonight, you could take off your shoe. So there are 4 major time periods here in South Florida. The first was 10,000 years ago, during the last ice age. And for many people who don't know much about the archaeology of Florida, 10,000 is a pretty big number to be talking about how long people have been here. I always love these images of the Paleo-Indian, which is what we call this time period, hunters, because for some unknown reason, every artist chooses to depict one man by himself in a loincloth trying to poke an elephant in the butt. And I don't know about you, but I don't think they would have survived the subsequent 10,000 years if this was actually their hunting technique. And my favorite part is usually the elephants have that, I'm just going to stomp you, look in their eye. So anyway, at this time period, it was during the last ice age. The megafauna still existed, so big elephant-like things, giant beaver-like things, giant sloth-like animals were living at this time. And these were people who had migrated over from probably North Asia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and they were following these large herds of animals. And it wasn't like one day they woke up and went, holy moly, we have got to get out of Siberia. You know what, Florida, let's go. No, this was completely an accident, and they probably were just following, all of you saw Ice Age, right? the movie for kids. And you know, there's that, the animals were coming and the people followed them. These were nomadic groups, hunters and gatherers. What they never show is the woman actually providing the vast majority of the food in the form of roots and little animals, because that doesn't make for good TV. The next of our four fingers, our two, is our 6,000 year time period, which is when the Windover site, we believe, dates to. And this is a time period when these guys are dead, but the people adapt. And at the same time, the Ice Age was ending, and the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee began to form for the first time in Florida, which, imagine having lived in Florida for 4,000 years with no Everglades and no Lake Okeechobee. As soon as the Everglades begin to form, people get out there and use them. Because of a difference in their hunting technique, we see people having a different social interaction as well. And this is what I call making Florida home, because this is the earliest evidence we have of sort of villages, where people were settling down and staying for longer periods of time. And this 6,000 BP, which is how we talk about prehistory, it means before present. This time period was when we see villages. This is when we see the first pottery being made, and so it was a very different time period. And we believe that hunting, fishing, and a lot of the life ways that continued on for the subsequent 6,000 years started there. All right, finger number 3. You may recognize places such as this. This is, actually, it's from Pineland? Is that correct? So this is Pinelands. My favorite part is that's what my dog looks like. But this was a time period 2,000 years ago when I described this as society gets complex. And so this is a time period when we see people making monumental architecture. And it just so happens that the monumental architecture made here was out of sand or shell or other materials, and probably topped by large sort of cheeky huts. But it's still, for all intents and purposes, monumental architecture. It's a giant pyramid. It's just not made out of limestone. And we see social complexity, where no longer is there sort of an egalitarian society. We believe that at this time period there would have been kings and queens and slaves, and sort of the things that we think about with complex societies. So this was the types of cultures that were encountered in South Florida when the Spanish arrived about 500 years ago. What happened, of course, as you can know, these people were annihilated in a pretty thorough fashion. There was somewhere around an 80% loss of life within the first 100 years. And then we, you know, made a pretty valiant effort to take care of that other 20% in the subsequent 500 years. That was political, sorry. So those were your four fingers. You had 10,000, 6,000, 2,500 as the major time periods. And all the archaeologists in the room are shuddering because I've reduced books and volumes of archaeology down to 4 fingers, but hopefully people remember 4 fingers. So these are the time periods we're talking about in South Florida. And the Windover site, where is it located? It's located up here near Cape Canaveral. This slide Rachel made to represent mortuary ponds. It looks like at this time period, 6,000 years ago, one of the ways that people got buried was not underground, but underwater. And because these people were buried underwater, it actually did a really good job of preserving their remains. Because if, you know, you bury someone in the ground and then, you know, the wolves come and dig it up or the jaguar comes and eats it. But if it's underwater, there was a lot less disturbance. So these are all major mortuary ponds where there had been human remains found. And because Florida has a number of these old ponds and springs, there are more human remains from this time period in Florida than anywhere else in the world. I know you're looking for another thing to be proud of. We've got more old dead people. So the Windover site, when it was discovered, Glenn Doran was the archaeologist in charge of the excavations. And this was a community project. The way it got done was over several field seasons in the mid to late 80s. He used students, scholars, and a huge number of volunteers to get out there and work on this site. One of the things from that first slide you saw, it was a pond, Windover Pond. And one of the first challenges they had was draining the pond and keeping it dry enough so that they could excavate. The problem with that draining process, as you all might know because of the canoe, is that material that has been wet for a long period of time, the minute you start drying it out, it starts decaying. So it was this very delicate balance of getting it dry enough you could see what was going on, but keeping it wet enough it didn't decay. And this presented all sorts of really cool scientific challenges of how do you preserve fabric that's 6,000 years old, but the minute it dries out, it decays. And there's actually a very nice video on the Windover site that goes through a lot of these things. What they found, though, was not just stuff, but people. There were over 100 individuals that they recovered from only a small portion of the site. It looks like people had come back for probably thousands of years to bury their dead at this particular place. The preservation on the remains for being 6,000 years old was extremely good, and that's because the pond was very tannic and mucky, and it covered the people up pretty quickly. So it wasn't like they were out there and exposed. When I talk about this to school kids, they always go, well, why didn't the gators eat them? I mean, it's a decent question, and it was because they got covered up by this soil fairly quickly and fairly well. You can see the depth that they're working at here. And that's all muck, so that was all underneath the water. And it was a huge scientific challenge, it was a huge archaeological challenge, and the results that came out of it were equally amazing. And something else people often ask, so since you guys aren't willing to talk to me, they ask, is this similar to bog bodies? And the difference between this and the bog bodies is that the flesh didn't tend to be preserved here. The flesh decayed, but there would be little bits, like they found hair or they found fabric under some of the individuals. And in particular, one of the things I think is interesting is they would find concentrations of plant remains in the area of people's stomachs in a few cases. Oh, shh, don't ruin it. Okay. So what else did they find? They found artifacts. In Florida, we end up having a lot of bone artifacts and teeth being preserved because of the wet conditions. There was some lithic materials that were found, and these were actually not, like at a normal archaeology site, they might be thrown into a trash pit or discarded in a midden. But these were actually burial goods associated with people, and there was a distinct relationship between the individual sex and the type of things that they were buried with. And some of the things that we find here, this is a weight for a spear thrower. This is probably a tool to straighten spear sticks. These are various weaving and basket making items. We have some shark teeth and some carnivore teeth there. So they found this whole variety of grave goods that were being put in with this. This site was not being used as a habitation area. This site was not a place that people came and had picnics. This was a place that you specifically came to bury your dead. And yeah, that one's good, isn't it? That's a small bird bone that probably historically, these small bird bones that were decorated like that were used for medicinal purposes. They were called sucking tubes. And so they were things that people would put on their skin. Remember when people used to use leeches to suck out the bad humors? There's a similar thing called cupping, where you heat up a glass cup and you put on your skin and it kind of gives you, oh, what's the word? A hickey. It gives you a little hickey suction. And they think that that's what this was as well, was potentially it. These were always associated with women, and they're small bird bones that could have been used as a similar medical technique, which is amazing. 6,000 years of the same medical technique? Must have had something going. Any other questions about this? So that was what they found with the burials. We believe that the burials, this is an artist's depiction of the burials, they were wrapped up in blankets and buried on their side, and then sticks were used to sort of keep them from floating. They were practical. And actually what Rachel found is this technique of using the sticks to sort of keep people down below those mortuary ponds. So that lends credence to it not just being at this place, but it was part of a broader religious ceremony to do this with people. And the people would be buried with their little bundle of goods. And they also think that some of these, there were other sticks that weren't being used to hold people down, and those may have been designating family plots or making sure that people could get back to where they needed to get to, sort of like a gravestone at a cemetery. So what else did they find? Well, being a plant person, of course I think the plant stuff is the coolest. And this is some of the earliest evidence for fiber technology that we have in the New World. This is a little tiny piece of a blanket that had been preserved underneath someone's back. So they would wrap these people up in blankets. And it's, you know, it makes sense. Of course they made baskets. Of course they wove. You know, but in at least my mind, there's sort of this image of people progressing and learning these techniques through time. And we see even at this 6,000 years ago time period that they were doing fairly elaborate weaving. There's a number of different weaving techniques and materials that were being used. And so this was a specific piece, but not the only one. And what is that piece made out of? A lot of them are being made out of palm fibers. Different types of palm fibers. And they were using, is anybody here a weaver? They would use different things for the warp and the weft, so that you need to have you might need strength this way and softness this direction, sort of like cloth is still made today. So they would vary that according to what the actual material was being used for. And here's an even tinier piece of that technology that they were using. It's a little piece of string. So these were people that were harvesting plant fibers, processing them in a way that then they could be made into thread, made into clothing, made into blankets, all the things we still use plant fibers for today. And there were people. There were a lot of people, and they were fairly well preserved. There was everything from, this was a neonatal young child that had been buried with a young woman in a small basket that she had on her stomach. I mean, you can't get much more poignant than that. These are clavicles showing the size range, femurs showing the size range, and these are some of the skulls. As you can tell, doesn't look like they had very good dental care 6,000 years ago. And these are people that were using their teeth as tools. So they weren't just, you know, eating Pop-Tarts. They were processing those plant fibers with their teeth. And you see distinctive use wear on people's incisors. People by their 40s at this time basically didn't have incisors because they'd worn them down using them. You'll also see cool gaps in people's teeth where they would use it to process fibers in the same place all the time. It's not something I would want to have, but it's kind of cool to see how people were using themselves as tools as well.
40 sounds kind of old.
They had a surprisingly long, these people were living surprisingly long. The one woman, the burial 125 that I'll talk about, she was over 60. So, and what we think archaeologically is that people did pretty well when they were hunter-gatherers. It's when they started doing agriculture that it all went to pot. You know, if you survived past 7, then you had a good chance of surviving to 40. There's this moment where if you can get to 7 and then 12, and you can manage to get through having babies, then there's not much reason, there's not a lot of things that would hurt you at that point. One of the ways that you can also tell Native American skeletal remains is the front incisors. They're called shovel incisors, that the back of them have a distinct divot in them. But what's interesting is if you look at the range of skeletal material from a similar time period, there's less indication of race than just people. Because if you looked at a group of skeletons 6,000 years ago, it's very difficult, and there are very few indicators that we would associate with races today, because there's so much variation in people that now the argument is that race is, we made it up recently as opposed to it being a skeletal indicator. And there's some other, there's a few very distinct characteristics, but then there's plenty of people of Native American descent who don't have these shovel-shaped incisors. So, and of course, the thing that everybody thinks is cool about the site is the brains. So as the archaeologists were excavating these human remains, they noticed that these skulls appeared to be heavier than expected. And they opened up the skulls and found that the majority of the remains that were whole enough to have skulls had brain tissue associated with them. And this is, one of those oddities of nature that the conditions were perfect in that pond to do this. So for 6,000 years, their flesh decayed, a lot of the fabric decayed, but somehow or another, the brain matter was preserved. As you can see, it kind of dried up and got smaller. And when they found this, of course, what does everyone think? Oh my God, you're going to be able to do DNA analysis, right? Wouldn't that be cool? And Glenn Doran thought that also, and he sent it out to try and have an analysis done to see whether or not this brain, so they could talk about family relations and all the cool things you can think of at a cemetery where you had DNA. And what the scientists found was that it had decayed over that 6,000 years. So they saw all the appropriate amino acids, but they no longer fit together in DNA strands. So they had denatured over time. And the way he described this, which I thought was perfect, was that if you had a stained glass window in a church and it fell, you still would know that it had been a stained glass window from a church, but it would be nearly impossible to put all the pieces back together. And that's what had happened with the DNA on these. However, they kept them, because in the future, who knows? That's one of the glories of archaeology, is what we know today is not going to be what we know in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. The science behind it's going to change, the questions are going to change, and so it's possible that in time this can be reanalyzed and a different story can come out. And that's why it's important that archaeology be done professionally, be done with care, be done so that it can be replicated as much as possible. Because if these had been taken out and not cared for appropriately, they wouldn't exist for the next questions to come up. So this is what everyone loves about the Windover site. I guess this would be a good Halloween story, is the brains. Apparently they had a low zombie ratio there at Windover. Come on. That was good. I only got one giggle in the front. So what Rachel did her master's and PhD on was the diseases and the injuries that these people had. And she looked at the whole collection to sort of look at it as a population and see what she could find. And there were a number of diseases that kept showing up again and again. This is infection on skeletal remains. Your bone, if you have a bad infection in your skin and it goes to the bone, develops these soft, fluffy layers like this. See the little tiny polka dots up there? That's an indication of anemia that shows up in skeletal remains. There's a lot of controversy in archaeology about what's causing the anemia, but these little dots are an indication of that anemic episode, and they kept showing up. This is a severely arthritic spine, and you can see the lipping there is the arthritis. Excuse me, that's what arthritis looks like in our skeletons. It's actually that you build extra bone, and that's why it hurts when you move your finger, because you're trying to get past that bone. They had a lot of dental issues, as you can imagine, because they were using their teeth as tools. There were traumas. This is a poorly healed, very poorly healed break in a leg. And there was also some very specific diseases that showed up there, and people survived with them. And this is a case of spina bifida. What was amazing about this is these people survived. These weren't people that died from these diseases. These were people who survived for a long time. To get this sort of glassy healing, that would be a long time, and they probably lost a good third of their femur. So can you imagine being a hunter-gatherer with that kind of limp, where you've got one leg that's a third shorter than the other? And this brought us, Rachel and I, to the point to start thinking about these people as people. That these were people who cared enough about their loved ones to help maintain a young child with spina bifida, to make sure that this person had a long, healthy-ish, happy life, that, you know, someone with arthritis that bad was still being fed and cared for a long period of time. You know, this level of disease would not be something that you were able to function as a working hunter-gatherer. These were people that needed help. And of course, the thing about Windover is no one survived. It's a mortuary pond, which means that eventually all of these people died, as we all do. But these were some of the diseases that she was seeing. So the diseases, as I mentioned, were the anemia, the degenerative joint disease, infection, trauma, dental disease. And this is the work that Dr. Rachel Wentz did her master's and PhD on. At the same time, Dr. Lee Newsom, not me, I didn't do it, analyzed the plant remains from the Windover site. And she's an extremely good paleoethnobotanist. She ended up winning a MacArthur Fellowship. She's no slouch. And she looked at 33 samples from 27 of the burials, and 6 of these were from the stomach region. 6 of these she thought were isolated enough and specific enough that they might actually represent Last Suppers, which is kind of cool. Because I know no one else here worries about this, but the thing about analyzing plant remains at archaeology site is there's really no way you can prove how a plant was being used. Was it being used for technology? Was it being used for food? Was it being used for medicine? But there's one way you can prove that they were consuming it in some manner, and that's if you see it in their stomach or other areas. Of these samples, she found 31 of them to be foods or medicines, and 19 of those, when I went back and looked at her work when Rachel and I were doing this, I decided had distinctly medicinal uses. And one of them was black nightshade, which has medicinal uses. It's also edible. What's interesting about many medicinal plants is they end up being on that line between food and medicine, that some parts of the plant are used as food and some parts of the plant are being used as medicines. So it was trying to make the relationship between this and this is what Rachel and I were having the discussion about. And yes, I checked with Lee Newsom to make sure I wouldn't make her mad by doing this. Okay, very, very complex image. Don't worry about it. The point of this is we looked at the diseases and the plants that she identified. Don't try and read it. It's a whole bunch of X's. What do you see? A bunch of X's. Why is that? Because Native Americans used these plants to relieve the symptoms of these diseases. Historically, these plants were being used to relieve symptoms of these diseases. And these are the plants that were at Windover. How perfect is that? Isn't that just like that perfect moment when you see the plants and you see the diseases? Now, I'm not saying that they used chestnut to heal anemia, but they might have used chestnut to help relieve intestinal worms that can cause anemia. So we didn't just look at the records and try and see anemia, degenerative joint disease, infection. We looked at what would the symptoms of these diseases be. and how would people have addressed the symptoms. Because I was recently corrected, and very rightly so, that plants don't tend to heal, they tend to relieve. So it's not as if any one of these plants was going to heal the anemia, but it might have relieved the symptoms, it might have lessened the intestinal parasite load, it might have helped build blood, but it was not really going to take care of anemia as a disease. So, and these are based on historic ethnographic uses. These are based on what the people at Windover actually suffered from. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah.
Many of us who are here tonight are with the Native Plant Society. We would love that little chart thing.
Native Plant Society. You guys are tricky that way, aren't you? This is based on work by Daniel Moorman, and that's all it is. I looked at Daniel Moorman's book, which is very similar to the Dan Austin? Dan Austin wrote his book after Daniel Moorman had done sort of a summary of these. And this was no big science. I looked and said, what are the symptoms of anemia today? And then how many of the plants that were at Windover were also relieving those symptoms. But if you email me, because you're going to pick up your flyer, right? And then you're going to email me, Michelle Williams, and then I'll send you that slide. And this led us to a particular burial, and this is burial 125. This was a woman who was at least 65 years old. So if living to 40 sounds pretty good, she was doing very well. And this woman had severe curvature of the spine. That's not a fun place to be in Spineville. And actually, her spine was so degenerated that some of the vertebrae actually had fused together. I know all of you with back problems are going, oh, geez. And so she would have not been a functional hunter-gatherer anymore. She would have been an important part of someone's family, but not able to run after deer or probably collect a lot of oysters by digging them out. So she had lived with her back like this for quite some time. What was interesting is that you can see this little piece of string. They collected a sample from her stomach region, and she had over 3,000 elderberry seeds, which is 3,000-ish elderberries in her belly when she was buried. So she had the degenerative joint disease and the severe curvature of her spine. So the question that came up was, what was in her stomach, and was the stuff in her stomach an effort to relieve the diseases that she was suffering from? So in her stomach region, Dr. Newsom found nearly 3,000 elderberry seeds. The plants in the darker colors are ones that have been used by Native Americans to help relieve the pain that would have been associated with that severe spine curvature and arthritis symptoms. So elderberry, holly, nightshade, prickly pear, water lily, wax myrtle, and quite a few wild grapes. What's important about this is that I'm not trying to say that those seeds were necessarily a medicine. This is the trick. So I'm going to make you hold on to your hats while we go on this little journey. I'm saying that the presence of these plants mean that the people knew how the plants functioned. This could have also been a pretty tasty pie, some wild grape and elderberry pie. There's no reason she couldn't have had it as a food rather than necessarily as a medicine. But the presence of these plants that had been used for specific diseases in association with this individual suggests to me that they also knew how to use the plant in other ways. The trick with plants, and this will be the second time I do this to you today, Ray, is that the fruits don't tend to have a lot of the bioactive chemicals. Fruits, they want the birds to come and eat them. Flowers don't tend to have a lot of bioactive chemicals because they want the butterflies to come and pollinate them. Plants are making chemicals to protect themselves, heal themselves, all the things that plants are supposed to do. So the parts of plant that you want to use if you're looking for a medicine are not the fruits and the flowers, which is what we see here, the seeds from the fruits and flowers. What you want are the shoots, the bark, and the roots, because those are the parts that the plant doesn't want somebody to come and chew on. Because if someone comes and chews the elderberry's bark off, the plant dies, and it doesn't get to do it again the next year. So bioactive chemicals tend to be concentrated in the parts of the plant that shouldn't be interacting with animals. Isn't that fun? Elderberry, I mean, people make elderberry wine today. They make elderberry jam. There was a case, look, I've managed to not talk about poop for nearly a full hour, and now I get to. There was a privy sample that I analyzed from Texas that had what I referred to as, you ready? You ready? This is tasteless. A buttload of raspberry seeds in the privy sample. So being an experimental archaeologist, I actually went and bought raspberries. No, it's not going to be as bad as you thought. Counted the raspberries, saw what the volume was, and then sieved them to see how many seeds came out. And I realized that this huge number of raspberry seeds that I thought was probably something funky going on was actually about 2 to 3 raspberry pies. You know, you have a barbecue, you make up a couple pies. All of a sudden, you've got a huge number of seeds I'm picking out of a sample from a privy. And similarly, this is a lot. There was something funky going on. That would have been a large, 2,000 elderberries is a large volume period. So there was something going on. And as I'll discuss, elderberry contains remember, the shoots, the bark, and the roots have cyanide. So it is possible that there was more going on besides just the berries. Yes, sir?
Would it help if you told us cause of death right now? You haven't mentioned cause of death.
I don't know.
So you didn't do autopsies or anything like that?
It was only skeletons left.
T. Dale Stewart at the Smith does that all the time. He lists cause of death.
Well, that was not something that was discussed, that all of these people died of something, and we don't know what in particular.
It wasn't the elderberries.
Probably not. There's no reason to assume that the elderberries, usually in archaeological context, it's a very rare time when we see something that obviously would have killed someone. Right, that would be it. But she didn't have that. I mean, for as much as she had going on, it wasn't like there was a big arrow stuck in her side. So there was nothing, she didn't have a chop mark in her head. And in fact, from the Windover site, there appears to only have been one violent death. And it was a younger male who had an arrow stuck in his butt and probably got a bad infection from it. So what was going on? We know one of the things that would have troubled her on a daily basis was her degenerative joint disease. And so we talked about what would you do to help relieve degenerative joint disease. You would use things like analgesics, like aspirin, to help relieve the pain. You would use things like antirheumatics and orthopedic aids to help relieve those symptoms. You're not going to actually heal this, but you can make it more comfortable. And so as you can see, there's a lot of plants that were showing up from the Windover site that were being used for this. And one of them is elderberry, which was a pain reliever, as well as an antirheumatic. And what's interesting about elderberry is it's a very popular herbal medicine today. If it worked for, I mean, wouldn't that be a great ad campaign? It's worked for 6,000 years. Try it today. If you go to the health food store, you'll see Sambucus cough syrup. Sambucus is the Latin name. It is, you'll see it in European herbals. It's very commonly used in Chinese medicine. This is a plant that sort of occurs all the way around the globe at about this level. It's a very useful plant. It's kind of pretty if you want it for your yard. And what's interesting is plants that work keep getting used. The reason that it's used today at Windover, in Europe, in China, is because it's an effective plant. Do I recommend that you start using it for your rheumatism? No. There are probably better choices. I would hope so, because I don't want you walking around with 3,000 elderberry seeds in your belly.
Were these all taken internally, or were some of them applied externally?
Right, and that's a great point. When you read herbals, they don't do a good job of telling you what the dosage is, how it should be applied. You know, like I said, the thing in her stomach were seeds, and probably the roots and shoots and other things would have been more effective for medicinal qualities. So it's interesting how a plant that's useful, like the tastiest part of it, ends up getting used. And the example for that is one of the most commonly used medicinal plants in North America were cherries. But it wasn't the cherries, it was cherry bark that was supposed to be used. And at some time in historic times, this bark that was very effective at soothing throats got made into cherry cough drops, which have no bark in them at all. Similarly, slippery elm used to be used as cough syrup and for coughs, and there's very little bark left in your basic slippery elm cough medicine. Apparently, I'm the only one who had to have slippery elm cough medicine. So the things that the parts that you use aren't necessarily the parts you want to eat. Does that answer your question? No. Okay, ask it again then.
Are any of them applied externally? I didn't hear anything to say that they were.
Sure, they're applied all different kinds of ways. The Native Americans who first used willow, which is where aspirin comes from, they would actually take the bark of willow and tie it around their heads, as opposed to taking an aspirin and swallowing this salicylic acid. So plants were used in all kinds of ways. They might be used in baths. They might be used as charms. They might be used internally. And what's interesting is a lot of times a plant will get used a bunch of different ways. So it will be used as a medicine, as a charm, as a food, and different parts of the plants are being applied differently. Whoa, 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 I got two hints. Did that answer it better? Huh? Okay.
Remember that Hippocrates recommended fellow bark for a hangover.
I wouldn't know why anyone in this room would ever have a hangover. And yes, and so I was saying earlier today, what's our largest organ? Well, our skin. And so why not apply some of these plants, especially, I mean, the example I used today was also the Nicoderm patches. You know, that our skin does a pretty good job of absorbing some chemicals. You know, the reason that they put the patch is so that people would stop associating with smoking, but it's also because the skin works just fine as a method of transferring those chemicals to our bodies. Yes?
I was just curious about how many elderberries the 3,000 seeds represent.
I believe that elderberries are a plant that has one seed per little berry. Like, so each of these little flowers makes one little berry, and I believe it's a single, at most it might be 3 seeds. It's not it's not 100 seeds per, yeah.
Are these plants seasonal, or are they available year-round, or if not, do you use dried versus fresh to make a difference?
Another great question. So could you get these plants all year round? Well, you couldn't get the flowers, and you couldn't get the fruits. But that's the nice thing about medicinal plants, is that the bark and the roots are always there. So if you know enough about your environment, you're cognizant of where the plants are, it would be very possible to find these plants and use them year-round. And for where I'm, in particular, where I'm located in South Florida, we have a 12-month growing season. So most plants there have parts available all year round. Yes, ma'am?
Yes, I have a very good book here called The Medicinal Plants and Herbs by Peterson Field. And it just mentions here this elderberry, that the bark, root, leaves, and unripe berries are toxic, called cyanide poison.
Right, and so that is the bioactive chemical in this plant, is cyanide. So, and cyanide is common in a lot of the rose family. That's where, I don't know if you've heard of people getting cyanide poisoning from apple seeds or cyanide poisoning from peach pits, but they also have this cyanide. At one time it was a problem because little kids would use the elderberry sticks as pea shooters. And luckily, the pea shooting tradition has died off because the kids would suck on these little sticks and then start to get cyanide poisoning from sucking on the sticks. My guess is they weren't smart enough to survive anyway. So multiple uses means multiple chances of it getting preserved. So how is elderberry used today? It's used as a juice, which is also made into a wine. It's a horticultural plant that could be used in gardens. You can make jellies and jams out of the fruit. And all of these parts, remember, are edible because we have to have the plant communicate with the outside world. It's the bark, the roots, that is the poisonous part. You can make fritters out of the flowers. The elderberry syrup is used as a flavoring. It's also supposed to be one of these new superfruits. So suddenly now elderberries are expensive. And finally, it can be used as a dye. So one of the things that interests me is that the more uses a plant has, the more likely it is to be preserved in the archaeological record. And this is a plant I see over and over and over again in the archaeological record. We usually just find the charred seeds at open archaeology sites, but it suggests that it had a multimodal use. And the more useful a plant is, the more likely it is you'll keep it around. So what I suggest in the end is that this disease, which people still suffer from today, 6,000 years ago would have used elderberry. These are seeds. I know, that was a plant geek moment. Elderberry was used to heal it then, and a leaf is used to relieve the symptoms today. Neither one of them actually heal the disease, but both of them are being used for the relief that they offer. And as we started out, this is what the Windover site looks like today. It was re-inundated and it's been preserved as a National Historic Landmark. If you want to see more about the Windover site, there's a wonderful book on the Windover site. There's a video available, and if you're in Brevard County, the Brevard County Historical Society has a museum that you can visit. And I want to, of course, thank the people who actually did this work. I got the easy part. I sat at my desk and looked at two pieces of paper and compared them. But the Windover volunteers, the scholars, and the staff who made that research possible, Drs. Doran, Newsom, and especially Dr. Wentz, who allowed us to do this research and did the initial work, which is why simple projects become possible, is by everyone cooperating together. All right, let's turn on the lights and wake people up. Yes, ma'am.
What happened with the condos, and whose land was it? Did the state have to buy it, or how did that all work out?
They ended up putting condos off to the side. One of the things you can do, and responsible condo builders are willing to do when you find archaeology sites, is there's usually green space. And so the archaeology sites can be the green space. So there was a subdevelopment that was made there, but it was not, it didn't end up disturbing the pond. The negotiations were done, and it's sort of the green space near it instead. Yes, sir?
The fact that you found close to 3,000 elderberry seeds associated with burial 125, I personally think that probably wasn't the stomach's content, because that might have been pretty toxic. But those traditions were, at that time on bundle burial, they buried the person with symbols of their cultural life that they gave to the tribe. And so she could have been a doctor, that could have been the tools of her trade, she could have been a clothing maker where the dye could have been, they would bury her with, honoring her for her contributions to their society, and that could have been a bundle buried with her, not in her stomach, but just part of her burial.
Right, and that's another perfectly valid interpretation of it. You know, that's the cool thing about archaeology until our time machine starts working better, that is no more or less valid than mine. And I wasn't actually at the site, so I don't know what made the researchers, they were excavating these bodies, determined that it was stomach contents versus bundle burial. But when you mentioned that, there's, in Mammoth Cave, there were several mummies that were buried, and in particular, there was a woman who had been buried with a string of seeds. And after doing the analysis on it, one of my friends determined that it was a female, an older, elderly female, string of seeds buried in a very special place. And these seeds are highly abortifacient. And so the concept is that, sure, it's a red seed, but there's plenty of red seeds around. Probably she was buried with it as a symbol of her abilities and dealing with womanly ways. Yes, sir.
Yes, some preservationists and I are fighting the city of St. Petersburg to sustain and preserve Maximo Park down in South St. Petersburg. The city of St. Petersburg does not distinguish between ecology and archaeology. And your viewpoint, is it important to have a functioning ecological system as part of preserving shell mounds, middens, etc.?
I don't know enough about the preservation of what helps stabilize that particular archaeology site. I know that that is a constant problem, though. And there's a site down in South Miami where it's a large shell midden with a huge oak tree in a hurricane zone on top of it. And when that oak tree goes, that mound is going to be destroyed because of the oak tree. But the park won't remove the oak tree because there's an owl that lives in it. And it's like, and it's a balancing act. And the problem with that particular issue is that the focus for a long time has been not on the people, but on the plants. We have to preserve the plants and the animals and the cute bunnies. And in that end, the archaeology gets ignored, or people get moved off the land, or stuff gets destroyed. My argument is that all right, all the plant people, you have to shut your ears for a second. Any attempt to do a native habitat is a very vain process, because people have been here for 10,000 years, so there is no such thing as virgin forest or a natural habitat. We've been we as an organism have been messing with our environment for 2.5 million years. And so pretending that we're going to, by removing houses and, planting in some wild coffee, make it a natural place again is a vanity. It would be nice, but it's not really true.
I just wanted to mention that in the case of Windover Florence Pond, wasn't this in a very exceptional situation where the developer really bent over backwards to work with the archaeologists?
Yes.
It always happened, and it was a very fortunate thing.
Yes, and that's true, that they were allowed to excavate and work in this place, and the developer not only allowed this to happen, but allowed it to happen for several years and set aside that land. That's a wonderful point. The way that archaeology gets preserved is by people caring enough to do it. And sometimes it's people you're not expecting. It might be the guy out at Lake Okeechobee who cares enough to let archaeologists use his airboat. It might be the people in this room who care enough to come to the lectures and volunteer to help with the projects going on here and with the FAS chapter. That it takes a village to save old villages. Maybe that shouldn't be a quote that we use from here on out.
There's a wonderful resource on the web, and I brought some bookmarks, the Trail of Florida's IndianHeritage.org. We have 6 featured sites, and one of them is Windover. And Rachel Wentz's voice is on that website, and it'll take you directly to Brevard Museum and find out a lot about it.
The museum's a very worthwhile place to visit for.
Well, in my opinion, it takes the interpretation of the archaeology site to make it interesting. That the site itself is good to preserve, but the story is what will catch people's imaginations. Yes, sir?
From what I understand, and maybe you can verify this, when Duran and company did that excavation, they excavated essentially half the site. The other part was left for future, if required, in future technology. So there's still half the story still there for future technology.
And that's true. In my training, archaeology, unless the place is going to be destroyed, tries to leave some for the future, because no matter how smart we think we are, somebody's going to, 50 years from now, there's going to be people going, oh, can you believe that they believe that? And 100 years, there's going to be a different story. And that's why it's important to preserve the sites as much as possible, because there's going to be other questions and other reasons for people to do these investigations. Yes?
What's going to happen with the remains?
I believe that the remains are still stored, that they weren't repatriated to my knowledge, and they're available for future researchers. And that's another huge issue for archaeologists is where do we store these, how do we preserve them? If everything has a story to tell, and we have to be careful. Usually human remains in the US today, there are laws that turn them back to the Native Americans associated with them and allow them to rebury those remains. Now, since this site was dug, it probably would not be dug today because of changes in the laws and changes in our attitudes towards human remains. So that when Rachel was learning how to do analysis of human remains, there is so little excavation of human remains being done in the US, she actually went to Europe to do it, because we're trying to respect the folks. All right, well, I'm going to let you guys go, because not everybody wants to talk. Some people want to walk. Thank you, guys.